I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report, where we have been documenting for you the collapse of the global economy. You see, all the Federal Reserve bankers and all of the king's brokers can't get any inflation started anywhere because the system is systemically shattered. Let's bring in political analyst and all-around great gal, Stacy Herbert.
Yes, Max, it is. And you know what? 3 years into this depression, The Guardian asks its viewers in this poll, are we heading for a prolonged economic depression? 36.4% say no, the world economy is over the worst and growth will be slow but steady. 63.6% say yes, the excesses of the financial crisis have yet to be purged.
Well, you see, in the United States, that the government is desperately trying to hire new workers to basically become more of a state-run economy because the free market capitalist system has failed due to the proliferation of predatory banks. Nobody did anything about them, and they gobbled up the infrastructure, the money, the credit, and now the U.S. government is desperately trying to emulate France or other state-run economies because these are the only economies that will survive.
Of course, the U.S. has started QE2 light, or QE light, some people are saying. But here's a headline about the U.S. U.S. is bankrupt, and we don't even know it. This is Lawrence Kotlikoff of Boston University. He's an economist. And he points to a fiscal gap of $202 trillion if you put everything on the balance sheet.
That's a big number.
Well, it's 15 times more than the official debt. And the discrepancy between the official debt and the actual net debt reflects what economists call the labeling problem. What is a labeling problem? Well, it's when Congress labels most of its liabilities unofficial in order to keep them off the books and into the future. So the question is, as Lawrence Kotlikoff is asked by Bloomberg presenter.
But is that to say that they are effectively lying to us?
Yeah, they're effectively lying to us. There's no question about it.
Yes, governments are lying to you. Wow, what a revelation.
Well, how can you tell they're lying to us? Well, take a look at this other video from America, and it's Third World America. Tens of thousands of Americans outside of Atlanta, Georgia, fight to get an application, just an application, for public housing. And here is, again, the presenter. He's just arrived at the scene, and look at what he says when he first arrives.
The first thought that I had when we pulled up on the scene here was whether we were in America, and I have to be very careful as a reporter not to overstep my bounds, but this was a very disgusting scene that we saw here in Metro Atlanta today. Dozens upon dozens of people passing out from the heat, standing in the heat just to get an application to apply for public housing.
Well, you know, Stacy Herbert, the same thing happened 300 years ago and 250 years ago, as the indigenous population of America was pushed onto reservations. Now, in the U.S., of course, if you're poor, you're considered to be part of the underclass. And the tendency now is to push the poor people onto reservations, ghettos, this type of thing. Of course, ghetto management is a hugely profitable business for the prison ghetto industrial complex, and those stocks are listed on the stock exchange. So if you want to get a stake in a prison industrial reservation type complex company, you can buy into it on the New York Stock Exchange. This is different than in the past, like in Europe in the 30s and 40s. You couldn't actually buy stock in those camps and profit from it on the exchange. But today, thanks to the magic of the New York Stock Exchange and the Wonder Boys on Wall Street, yes, you too can own shares in a concentration camp in America. What else?
So the question is there an economic depression? When we've looked at these videos of tens of thousands of Americans fighting just to get an application for free housing, and we see from Kotlikoff that the U.S. government is actually in $200 trillion in debt. And next we look at not the poor people, but the rich people, and bank profits are soaring. So it takes us to this headline from Steve Keen, who models financial instability, and it reads, "Bank profits, a sign of economic sickness, not health." And when he models financial depressions, what he finds is that one symptom of an economy that is headed for a depression is a rise in bankers' share of income at the expense of workers and capitalists. So if you look at his chart, you see that it's between 5 and 6% of GDP, this is in Australia, is from bankers. And he's saying that the stable amount is at 1%. So this is why we're going to have continuing instability until that gets down to 1%. We're going to continue with this, he says.
No, the missing thing for guys like Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon would be those magnificent pimp mobiles and maybe a purple felt hat with a feather sticking out, because basically they're pimps. They're Wall Street pimps, and they're making an outsized profit for their pimping. And as a result, the normal economy that exists outside of the ghetto is shrinking.
You know, Steve Keen also says the only way to get out of this depression is to shrink that income to the bankers down, or to abolish large slabs of debt, which brings us to the next headline from Ireland. Irish debt under fire on fresh bank jitters. So Ireland's borrowing costs are soaring again. And part of the reason is that it's just emerged that the European Commission revealed this week that it had approved government support worth 24.3 billion euros for Anglo-Irish Bank, AIB, which is significantly higher than what Dublin said it would be in the spring.
Well, they created the bad bank, NAMA, and that's an open-ended slush fund. And the number of bad debts in Ireland will continue to increase as they disclose magically, oh, more bad debts. Oh, look, the little leprechaun with his shillelagh stick led us to the end of the rainbow, and there's more bad debt. And this will just continue on as the pimps in the Irish banking system get out their shillelagh stick green felt hat, and they're driving around in their little Irish pimp mobile, and they're abusing the population like we see in other countries.
The head of the Irish Central Bank, Patrick Honohan, fumed. They were egregious, in a league of their own, saying of AIB. If it hadn't been for them, the losses would have been manageable. The net cost to the Irish state of recapitalizing the banks is 25 billion euros, or 15% to 16% of Irish GDP. It is nearly all the result of AIB.
Well, it's like a shopkeeper at the end of the year, after having had everything stolen from them, saying, well, my business would have been manageable had it not been for the fact that I got robbed. Yeah, it's right. The Irish economy is sinking into oblivion because it was robbed. They're not performing any function that's useful to society unless you consider larceny to be useful to society, unless you consider the parasites of the Irish banking system somehow creating a symbiotic relationship with the citizens of Ireland. Somehow there's a mutual beneficial relationship going on. But it doesn't appear that way. It just appears as though they're thugs stealing money from Irish people, getting the Irish people getting absolutely nothing in exchange except a continuation in the collapse of the housing market.
Well, Max, you've mentioned Lloyd Blankfein, and as he says, you know, they're doing God's work, these bankers. Nuns accuse banks in $5 million lawsuit. So Germany's Deutsche Bank and U.S. investment bank Morgan Stanley are facing a $5 million lawsuit led by a group of Irish nuns. So these Irish nuns were sold a batch of, you know, these crazy derivative products to hedge all their potential risk. And, of course, they ended up losing their investment. Right.
They were sold from Wall Street a product that was sold to them as a risk management product. You know, actually, it's just karmic justice, because wasn't the Catholic Church selling indulgences back in the medieval days to people, rich people who wanted to avoid having to go down to the nether regions of the underworld for having committed sins, and the Church sold them indulgences. Remember this? One of the popes was selling indulgences. Now, these nuns, karmically, the wheel is spun, and they were sold indulgences by Wall Street to them to avoid the risk of their normal investment activity that didn't need to be sold, these activities to begin with. And so there you have it, nuns. What comes around, goes around, and comes around again.
Well, we've talked about riots over housing and outright fraud and theft from the Irish citizens and nuns. Now, take a look at this headline. Bounty hunters to cut benefit fraud by £1 billion. 1 billion measly pounds in the UK. Private agencies are to be paid by the UK government to reduce benefit fraud by £1 billion. No, not the theft of £1 trillion in the UK by banks. This is to go after normal Joe Schmo, the ones rioting for those public housing. Cameron says we are looking urgently at different options for reform, tougher penalties for fraud, more prosecutions, encouraging those who know fraud is taking place to come forward, and making greater efforts to reclaim money that's wrongly paid.
Yeah, David Cameron, I'm very disappointed in David Cameron because he owes me, by my calculation, $10 billion.
Why doesn't he hire us to be bounty hunters to go get the $1 trillion lost?
Tell David Cameron, he owes us $10 billion. We've been doing it for years, saying that these banks in the UK, who are they? Oh, Barclays, Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland. Remember we said 6 months before the collapse of Northern Rock Bank that it was going to collapse for the very reasons it did collapse. Where's our finder's fee? Where's our bounty? That's $10 billion large you owe me, Dave Cameron. Don't make me fly to London right now and go down to number 10 Downing Street and have to shake it out of your pockets. Don't make me do it. You owe me. Oh, I see. You're going to pretend like you don't know how the banking system works. Anyway, continue.
To continue on this benefit fraud thing, Chris Grayling defends plan to use credit rating agencies to help catch benefit cheats. The welfare minister, Chris Grayling in the UK, is saying that if there is a huge mismatch between the way you are living your life and the amount of money you are supposed to be receiving from the state in benefits, surely it is right and proper that we should be saying, how is that happening? How is it happening, though? I mean, this is what we were talking about with Lawrence Kotlikoff. The U.S. is bankrupt. They're obviously living far $200 trillion beyond their means, which is 15 times the size of the economy.
Yeah,
where's all the fraud?
$200 trillion number is a big number. I mean, so the GDP of the entire country is $10, $12 trillion, right? The entire GDP of planet Earth, of the globe, is something like $50 trillion. So they're saying that the United States alone has more debt than 4 times that of planet Earth.
Yes.
So that if they had populated and colonized a big planet like Jupiter, and they put a neoliberal model, and Milton Friedman was running Jupiter, then today they'd have $200 trillion in debt. But you need a big planet like Jupiter. Why do you have so much debt on a small planet like planet Earth?
Why are you talking like that?
I'm talking like Jackie Mason. You see, Netanyahu's back in the news. We'll be talking about him soon enough, Netanyahu. You got any more headlines?
No, Max, I don't.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Max.
When we come back, we'll be going to Jerusalem to speak with Cher Heber. No, not Benjamin Netanyahu, although there is an invitation out to speak with Benjamin at any time, standing invitation. We will be going to Jerusalem. Stay right there. Don't go away.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. It's time to go to Jerusalem to talk with economist Cher Heber of the Alternative Information Center. Cher, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me. I like your show very much.
Okay, thanks. Cher Heber, you're part of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, the BDS movement. Tell us more about it. Why is it necessary, in your opinion?
Well, BDS is a call by Palestinians, first and foremost, which has been joined by supporters from around the world and also from Israel, such as myself. But it's first and foremost a Palestinian call, and calling on international solidarity for people to support the Palestinian struggle for freedom against Israeli repression, and to do so by putting economic pressure on Israel, rather than by using force of arms and military means to try to force the Israeli government to recognize its obligations under international law and respect the rights of Palestinians.
Is the boycott having any impact?
First of all, we have to consider that it is a very new, a young movement. The call by the Palestinian civil society organizations is from 2005. There were very sporadic attempts at boycott before that. So from 2005, the call has grown very rapidly. And unfortunately, the main thing that causes the call to grow and the support for BDS to grow in the world is every time that Israel attacks the Palestinians, attacks Gaza, kills innocent civilians, then people are outraged and they express their outrage by supporting boycott. There's been a lot of international companies that were already affected by the boycott in the sense that they faced a lot of pressure in other countries around the world to stop providing Israel with the tools that Israel needs to oppress the Palestinians and continue to occupy the Palestinian territories. I can give you hundreds of examples, but if I can give just one good example, I would say that Veolia, which is a large French company that provides tramways and public transportation all around the world, has signed a deal with Israel to provide a tramway in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem. And since this area is illegally occupied by Israel, illegally annexed, Veolia is actually doing something illegal by providing Israel with this service. Now, because of all the pressure by the international community on Veolia, to stop dealing with Israel, they've lost several contracts around the world, and the most important of which is the building of the tramway in Stockholm. And that was a project worth 3 billion euros. So after Veolia lost such a huge contract, they've decided actually they want to sell their stocks in Israel, and they want to pull out of the project. But right now nobody's willing to buy their stocks for the tramway in Jerusalem, putting them in a very difficult position. I think the result of companies like Veolia getting into this difficult position where they commit an illegal act, then they face international boycott, is that other companies would think twice and maybe thrice before getting into an involvement with the Israeli government.
Now, when I first heard about the boycott, it reminded me of the boycott that was put on Barclays Bank during the apartheid regime in South Africa. And of course, that word apartheid has been used by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter to describe what's going on with Israel and Palestine. Are there some similarities between the boycott and apartheid movement of South Africa and the eventual resolution that came to bear there, and what's happening over there between Israel and Palestine right now? Because if you use that as an example, that international boycott did tip the balance in favor of the freedom movement.
Well, of course, there are many similarities. There are also differences. Perhaps the most striking difference is that in apartheid South Africa, the white population actually had a role within the economy for the black population of South Africa as their workforce. And they wanted to exploit the black workers. While in Israel, Palestine, the Israeli government is trying to avoid exploiting the Palestinian workers, but rather to get them to leave altogether, to get them completely out of the region. So that's a difference. But in other respects, apartheid is very similar. First of all, you have a population of 11 million people in Israel-Palestine together. Now, in that population, Jews are 49% of the population. So they're now a minority for the first time in many years. Jews are a minority in Palestine, and yet they have 78% of the votes for parliament, which means that the Zionist parties, represented mostly the Jewish population in Palestine, have an automatic majority. They always control the government. So in that sense, you have a large disenfranchised group. You also have rules that state that certain roads are for use by Jews only and certain roads are not, that Palestinians are not allowed without a permit in certain areas while Jews are allowed. And that creates, of course, a system of separation. Separation in Afrikaans, the language of South Africa, of the white people in South Africa, means apartheid. Apartheid means separation. So the boycott of South Africa is not just the boycott of the Barclays Bank. It was a very widespread boycott supported also by governments, and it put a lot of pressure on the white population of South Africa to do away with apartheid. But actually, many historians today are very skeptical about how much boycott was effective in the case of South Africa, because they're saying that South Africa is a country rich with natural resources. They had many ways to find substitutes for what they couldn't import, couldn't export, and they found ways to withstand boycott for a very long period of time. Boycott started in the 50s, and apartheid only collapsed in 94. But in Israel, Palestine, the situation is very different, because here Israel is one of the most globalized economies in the world, compared to its size, of course. It's the 10th biggest per capita importer in the world and the 8th biggest per capita exporter in the world. And that means that Israel is very sensitive to any kind of international boycott. We cannot hope, in the short run at least, to have a very widespread boycott like there was in South Africa. But even a fraction of that boycott would be enough to put a stop to the Israeli economy, in the sense that the Israeli government would simply have no choice but to start complying with international law. Also, Israel is not very rich in natural resources like South Africa is, and Israel is very much dependent on aid from other countries, on its good relations with Europe as its biggest trading partner, with the United States as the biggest provider of aid to Israel.
Let me ask you right there. Can you talk a little bit about the U.S. role in sustaining this apartheid model?
Without taking any of the responsibility of the Israeli government to the war crimes, to the atrocities committed, unfortunately, on a regular basis in Palestine, there is also a very large role to be played here by the American government, by the U.S. government. First of all, the United States rewarded Israel for the occupation of 1967 by starting to increase aid to Israel, especially military aid. And Israel gives, the U.S. gives Israel $3 billion every year in military aid. Now, the U.S. also tries to present itself as the kind of arbiter between Israel and the Palestinians in the peace negotiations. But in fact, what kind of arbiter gives weapons to the aggressor in a dispute? Obviously, they're not objective. They are supporting Israel, and they are promoting conflict in the Middle East. They're giving Israel a political umbrella, which protects Israel from criticism when Israel invades Lebanon, for example, or more recently when Israel invaded Gaza.
Let me ask you now, you mentioned this $3 billion or so of U.S. aid per year. And according to international law, from what I understand, of course, it's illegal to give aid to any country with a nuclear program. So since Israel does have a big nuclear program with some estimates suggesting up to 200 nuclear warheads, that right there makes it an illegal act for the U.S. to give them any money at all in so-called aid. And as a U.S. taxpayer myself, I've tried to lobby the Israeli government to give me back the many billions of dollars that we've given them, filtered through my own experience with the economy in the U.S. I figured that Benjamin Netanyahu probably owes me about $3,000 personally. I'm not holding my breath that he'll pay me my money back anytime soon, although I think morally and ethically he should. Yeah. But let's move on. How is this boycott being received inside Israel?
Well, a lot of people are saying that boycott can actually turn the Israeli society even more inwards and make Israelis more fortified, become even more belligerent. But in reality, the way that boycott is already affecting Israeli society is that it promotes discussion. And it forces Israelis to realize that there are some people around the world who are looking at what they're doing and they care about what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And part of the reason that they care is just like what you just mentioned. They have a stake in that conflict as well. It's not just a regional conflict, it's also a global conflict. And because of that, Israelis are starting to realize that they need to change their strategy somehow. Now, there is no strategy that will save Israel from boycott except ending the repression. And I think if we go back to the example of South Africa, the boycott against South Africa wasn't successful in convincing white people in South Africa to abandon apartheid, because even one day before the collapse of apartheid, 90% of the population in South Africa of the white population still supported apartheid.
All right, now you write the Economy of Occupation Bulletin. Tell us how the occupation has altered the economies of both Palestine and Israel. Talk a little bit about this.
Well, it's easy to talk about the Palestinians because they're dependent on Israel in every aspect. Occupation is existing in every aspect of their lives, day and night, and it's a population that now only is able to sustain itself by international aid. Most of it comes from Europe, and this aid keeps the Palestinian population in a state of sustenance, where they cannot develop, they cannot invest, but at least they're not starving. which is something that also serves the interest of Israel. But the Israeli economy has become also very much affected by the occupation and by the massive military investments, and also by the Palestinian resistance to the occupation, which made Israel into a kind of fortress state, obsessed with security and security guards. Israel invests a higher portion of its GDP on defense than any country in the world. 12.3% of the GDP in Israel is government expenditure on defense, security, and so on. There's also a public expenditure on defense which isn't measured, so we don't know what portion of it is out of GDP.
I mean, it just seems basically, I mean, I grew up in New York City, more or less, and Harlem was a ghetto, and the cigarette companies and the tobacco companies and the gambling companies and the supermarkets that overcharged, they make a big profit out of a ghetto. I mean, Palestine is Israel's profitable ghetto. Yes or no?
Especially Gaza. Gaza is now even more than a ghetto. It's a prison camp, because the Palestinians in Gaza are not able to export anything, but they can still import. And they import using the aid money that they get from the international community, and most of what they buy with this money is products from Israel. So that actually means that, for example, one Israeli company has full monopoly over selling petrol and petrol products to Gaza. So that's a very extreme example of that kind of ghetto economy. But it also exists in the West Bank, that is divided into small Bantustans, surrounded by the wall of separation, where again, people are dependent on international aid, and they buy most of their stuff from Israeli companies. If you go to a supermarket in the West Bank, you see that most of the products are actually from Israel.
When you run a ghetto, you act like ghetto runner. I mean, you can't have a ghetto and a prison and pretend like you're some kind of moral or ethical example. That doesn't work. I mean, you got to play the role. I think the Knesset should adopt more of the pimp look so people understand what's really going on there. All right, Keiser Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank Stacy Herbert and, of course, my guest, Keiser Herbert. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.